when we mess with people's speech and we start telling them what they can and cannot say, this may sound nuts, but I believe it's almost like trying to cut off people's fingers or something. Like it is that fundamental to just our basic ability to express and to be.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast. I'm here today with Dr. Chloe Carmichael, who is a clinical psychologist and USA Today best-selling author of a book about the mental health benefits of free speech. So I'm super excited to dig into that. So welcome, Dr. Carmichael.
Thanks, Ryan. It's great to be with you. And you can call me Chloe. It's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chloe.
Yeah.
Let's start off with just get a little bit about your background, who you are, where you come from.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist. Before that, by background, I was a yoga teacher. So I actually did not finish college even till I was 29. And so I think that's why I was able to go to Columbia and get a PhD in clinical psych and still have my head on straight. I think a lot of young people, especially that go through a lot of these programs, they just get totally indoctrinated. So I'm thankful I had enough of my own life experiences before getting all that training so that hopefully I feel like I could take the good stuff, but still keep my common sense.
There's so much to dig into there already. So one thing is being a yoga instructor. So kind of treating the body in a sense and going to treat the mind. And I feel like a lot of times you can get really, if you're digging into textbooks, you can stay at a very cognitive level. And you probably, I'm guessing, went in with a more holistic approach than most people, having that background.
Yeah, so as a yoga teacher, I was doing mostly individual lessons. In New York City, it was just more convenient, and frankly, you make a lot more money that way. It was like to support myself, doing private lessons was just a much better move financially too. But what that allowed for doing individual yoga lessons with, kind of busy, stressed out New Yorkers, if you think about that type of person, that type of profile, they tend to have a lot of cognitive energy, and a lot of them were doing yoga because they were seeking balance, literally and figuratively. And so through that work and doing a lot of meditation, I was always really into the body side, but also the meditation side of yoga. And that's actually what made me want to get a PhD in clinical psychology, is because people were really interested, and I was really interested just in the stress side and in the personal kind of energy side of it. And at a certain point, I almost started feeling like they were ascribing more knowledge to me than I knew deep down that I actually had, but I was interested in it. And so that's what got me to go get the PhD. And I thought I would end up with, a practice that was really revolving around that super holistic stuff. And my first book was about the healthy function of anxiety, which is to stimulate preparation behaviors. And, I was really in that track for a long time, and I loved it. But then during COVID, some issues came up about free speech where I realized I was holding back a lot of stuff myself, and that even just to be successful in New York, and I was doing like a great deal of national media, like VH1, Inside Edition, big stuff. But I just knew that there were just certain opinions that you couldn't really say, just like in graduate school. I just knew that there were only certain opinions that I could really go into. And that was fine. I didn't think it was a big deal. And then during COVID, there started to be some stuff that I thought was a big deal to not be saying. And so I crossed the line and said it, talked about some stuff. And then it was almost like a floodgate where I realized, wow, like there's a lot going on when we are authentic, when we really say what we really believe. And then, of course, I felt almost like a fool as a clinical psychologist. I was like, how could I have not even thought of this before? That obviously we have to, free speech matters for our mental health. And so here we are now with my new book.
It's so exciting. I want to get into you speaking out in the book and everything like that. But before we get into that, one of the things that I really like to get into is you talked about the indoctrination of school. And it seems so prevalent. It seems like almost everyone who comes into that system just gets swept up into that indoctrination. But there's certain people who I talk to who seem to have some immunity from it. And you talked about going to finish school a little bit later than some other people. People I've talked to who came back as older students or who were in the military or who had some kind of work experience beforehand seem to have a little bit more immunity than people that just go straight into college. How do you think you had some immunity against those ideas?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors. So, literally your age, as I think, everybody and their brother knows now about how the brain doesn't fully mature until your mid 20s. And so when people do go to school, when their brain is, just literally softer and still forming, I just think it's a lot easier to kind of mold their brain and teach them things that they're not necessarily going to question because their brain is just literally still seeking to, coalesce around information. And then when you also have that element of life experience, again, for me as a yoga teacher, and I'd had many previous life experiences. I was an emancipated minor and I had had, pretty colorful life in many ways. And so when I would learn about, some of the race stuff or even the gender stuff or, class stuff or, issues about the homeless, I mean, I put that like in air quotes because as anyone who's actually had much experience with with that culture, which I actually have. I mean, it's funny, I'm nearly 50 years old now, but as I was an emancipated minor in the grunge era in the 1990s, so I had a totally different life and experience as a younger person. And so I think people are just now finally realizing that like the vast majority of the homeless on some level are choosing it, right? Like that it's in many ways about, drugs and not wanting to have, your quote mental illness treated. So anyway, I was learning a lot of the stuff in school that I felt like it had these, I think, very patronizing assumptions about whether it be about race or frankly, whether it be even about women. Like this whole thing about how we're oppressed under the patriarchy and stuff. I was just like, well, that's not really my experience, and as a woman, even having been able to use the fact that I was a woman to my own advantage in many situations, so I kind of, just had a different take on it than what they all did. And to a certain degree, I was deferential with it, even intellectually. I was like, okay, well, this is like my life experience, but what do I know? I'll learn from them. But then as I just continued to be I worked in a lot of very prestigious labs and things, but just came to see that, and I think you and I talked about this on Twitter once, that a lot of times they really kind of cherry pick their data. I kind of started to see how some of the sausage got made. And so, yeah, a long-winded answer to your question, but I just think that when we have our own life experiences, we're a little bit older, or maybe just a very strong-minded person, we're not as vulnerable to just buying hook, line, and sinker whatever they tell you in school, just blindly.
Something that stood out to me is just from what my experience shows. It sounds like yours too. Is how disconnected a lot of these academics seem. Like I remember hearing professors talk about the unhoused, and I'm like, do you know the names of any of these unhoused? Like they're like a foreign creature to you. They're not like actual people that you know, And it feels like these are people who are like on their way to wine yoga, talking about the plight of the marginalized, but like they learned about the marginalized in a book or something. Like it seems like a complete disconnect to me.
Yeah, and there's such an arrogance, that goes with it too. I mean, I feel like the phrase virtue signaling is, like it's almost like worn out at this point, but sometimes cliches are true for a reason. There's such an arrogance that I feel like so many of them get. Like when I say them, I mean like, these, kind of academics or the expert class or whatever that are, kind of telling the rest of the general public about how life really is, or, how we would see things if we understood.
Mm.
I do feel like on some level it makes them feel morally better, morally superior. And it's interesting. I go into this in my book I unpack the psychology of groupthink, which is another word I think the public generally knows by this point, but I don't believe, do fully understand it in its true academic sense. And Irving Yannis, who is the psychologist that coined the term groupthink, he laid out 8 major, conditions that create groupthink. And one of them is a belief in the moral superiority of the group. And I do think that that's a big one, because and it's related to the other factors, which are things like direct pressure upon dissenters, right?
Mm.
So, for example, if I were to have raised my hand in a graduate school class and said, well, uh, kind of challenge some of their orthodoxy about, race or gender or quote the unhoused, um, they would have tried to frame me, I think, as, kind of like insensitive, conservative, ignorant, callous. Whereas ironically, it's their very policies a lot of times that are the most condescending, that do the most harm. So if they want to have a kindness competition, it can be like a whole other situation. But it's just interesting the way that they go to that. And then some of the other interesting factors of groupthink include the illusion of unanimity. So which is one of the things you have then when you have this classroom where I doubt I was even the only one that was secretly questioning it, but I felt that way because nobody else would question it. And so the academic snowball just gets rolling that way, I think, sometimes, and then you end up with groupthink.
Yeah, that groupthink part is so fascinating. And it seems like there's so often just an assumption of bad faith. Like they don't care if you've done work with the homeless or, certain populations say, hey, I think the way you're going about it is ineffective and we could be more efficient in our help over here. They just assume, well, you don't care about this population. You should check your privilege. There's an assumption of bad faith, like from the get-go. Like there's no appropriate way to disagree.
Right, or God forbid you want to talk about black crime and talk about how maybe it's not necessarily because of racism, right? Well, then, bam, that belief in the moral superiority of the group and direct pressure upon dissenters and everything else comes into play, and you're a racist, and all this stuff when like maybe what you might even be trying to do is actually ask some questions that could actually provide ultimately a lot more relief for urban communities than, some of these really debilitating research paradigms about, that don't even make sense, right? Like if you even want to ask the question and say like, well, why is it, that black crime is so much worse now than it was even before Jim Crow? If the problem is racism, how is it that we now have actually less racism, but the crime problem is worse? Could it be something besides racism? The idea that you can't even ask that question in what are supposed to be research-oriented, intellectually hungry circles. I mean, group think. Like it has it written all over it,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah, and I think from the conservative perspective, a big solution that they offer is encouraging people to take personal responsibility for their lives. And from that progressive perspective, just asking that is considered victim blaming. Like that solution is just kind of taken off the table. And to me, what you're doing, like I think from their perspective, they think they're being kind and empathetic, but it seems that they're actually like denying people agency and autonomy and kind of taking tools out of their hands by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, personal responsibility, of course, they hate that phrase. Like you said, it's politically coded to the right, and the mental health field is like 90% plus, liberal. Yet, and I talk about this in the book, there's abundant research within the psychology field to show that self-efficacy, which is basically almost the same thing as personal responsibility if you really unpack it, um, self-efficacy is tied to positive mental health as both a mediating and a moderating variable for like, the people that really want to dig into it on an academic level. And self-efficacy, of course, is, your ability for self-reliance, to do what you say that you're going to do. And also, there's abundant psychological literature to show that people who have an internal locus of control versus an external locus of control fare a million times better mental health wise and resilience wise. And the internal locus of control, again, is your belief that your choices control your life, for the most part, as opposed to external locus of control, meaning like, you believe that life just happens to you, like it's the systems of oppression and blah, blah, blah. And again, it's like, it's so disempowering, as you said, to take that away from people, especially here in the United States, where even our poorest people live like kings, absolute kings and queens. And that is a gift, that awareness, if they could just be told that, and instructed and encouraged to run with that, as opposed to focusing on, some of these issues that I really don't believe are actually the drivers of the dysfunction within their lives or their communities.
Mm, that is interesting. I feel like we've been talking around it for a minute. Let's go ahead and get into your book. Tell me about
Yeah.
that.
Sure. So the book is called Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly. People can go to freespeechtoday.com. I really kicked myself because a few months ago, freespeech.com was available for $1,500 and I should have bought it, but I didn't. So I have freespeechtoday.com, which is okay. But yeah, so the book was endorsed by Dr. Phil, which has been an interesting one too, because Dr. Phil also kind of went off the reservation, so to speak, recently as far as saying some unorthodox things, to the point where when I announced this book to my mailing list, because I have a lot of therapists in my mailing list, because I also have sold products and videos that help therapists to build a successful practice. And I've gotten some incredible pushback. I've had them write to me and say that they're unsubscribing from me because of my new work and because of my affiliation with Dr. Phil, that they say that my affiliation even with Dr. Phil now causes them, they say I'm violating Section 6 of the Social Workers Code of Ethics. I'm not a social worker, but they're like, as a social worker themselves, they feel that they can no longer follow me because of this. And I wrote back and I'm like, what do you mean? Can you help me understand? I genuinely, I looked at Section 6, like, I don't know what this is. How am I, they never write back. You know what I mean?
What are they referring to in Section 6?
I think they're talking about probably like that social workers have a commitment towards social advocacy, and maybe the fact that, for example, my book talks about the importance of free speech and the concept that words are not violence, and that it is psychotic for, say a trans identifying person to say that someone is, quote, threatening their existence because I say that a man cannot become a woman. That I say it's actually a disservice to a trans identifying person. Number one, to validate the idea that they can become a woman. But number two, to suggest to them that people are threatening their existence by stating a different perspective on their situation. I mean, what an anxiety-provoking way to live your life, right? To think that my existence is threatened because you say that I'm not what I think I am, that threatens my existence. I believe that's actually one of the worst things that you could do to a person. So anyway, I talk about a lot of these issues in terms of free speech, in terms of not only some of the legal strictures around it, because again, uncertainty increases anxiety. So I take a moment to just kind of unpack like what exactly is free speech legally. But then I look at self-censorship and, kind of free speech more in the colloquial sense of like, how free do you really feel to even just say what you really believe? And somehow I guess that they feel like I'm going against social advocacy and social justice by doing that, because I'm encouraging people to say what they really think. Whereas I believe it's the opposite. I believe it is I would think if we're interested in social justice, human right number one would be people can say what they think, but I guess not.
That's so fascinating to me. And the first thing that pops up is when you hear words like social justice or social advocacy or, public engagement, all these kind of buzzwords, like if you're not initiated into the club, these sound very vague, like you could apply them in any way, where you're like, yeah, I support free speech because that's my form of social public advocacy. But if you're in the club, that's not what social advocacy means. It's got a very specific meaning, and they're trying to hide behind these vague words. But like, if you're in the club, you know exactly what they're talking about. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's and again, that's one of the things that I feel is really bad for people's interactions and their authenticity as well as for their cognitive process is when we can't, speak clearly. It's like this Orwellian double talk, right? Or double speak. Moreover, when there are certain words we cannot say anymore, right? Like even when I used the phrase off the reservation, when I said Dr. Phil went off
Mm,
the reservation, like
Native
when
Americans.
yeah, when there's like politically incorrect, words and phrases, that we're not allowed to quote aloud, to use anymore. Um, I talk about this in the book too. It's interesting. We have specific brain regions that are devoted to the production and comprehension of language. And we have unique brain regions, for example, for swear words. So what's interesting is
Mm.
like if a person has a stroke and they lose their ability for language, a lot of times they can actually still swear, and it's like a different part of the brain.
Oh.
Yeah. And so I speculate about this in the book that I would be curious, and I don't think the study's been done, but like, would the same thing on some level be true for, politically incorrect ideas? Like, are there kind of just parts of the brain that are like for
Mm.
taboo expression or whatever? And so the incredible psycholinguist Steven Pinker from Harvard has said, that humans need to speak the way that a spider needs to spin a web. It's a
Mm.
human, it's in our DNA, and babies even will respond to human voices, even making nonsensical language in different ways than they'll respond to other sounds. So when we mess with people's speech and we start telling them what they can and cannot say, this may sound nuts, but I believe it's almost like trying to cut off people's fingers or something. Like it is that fundamental to just our basic ability to express and to be, that I think it's capacitating. Is that a word? It's handicapping to people on a very profound level when we start telling them what they can and cannot say outside of, again, the already existing legal structures. Like it's, you cannot say incitement to violence. Like I can't, call it free speech if I want to tell someone to go take out a hit on my neighbor or whatever. Like that's not free speech. Or,
Yeah.
defamation, libel, those things are already illegal. But as far as just simply any kind of viewpoint at all, and I say that even as a woman, if somebody wants to have the viewpoint that women are stupid or whatever, say it. I don't care. You know what I mean? In fact, it's better because then we can debate it. I can expose the flaws in the thinking, or I can avoid the person if I don't want to be around people like that. But again, it's such a myth when they say like, oh, well, it'll be a safe space when we shut everybody up and make everybody pretend to say stuff that they don't really believe. Like, how the hell is that safe? Right? Like the whole thing is so nuts.
Wow. I'm interested in digging into how this uh, affects us cognitively because I've done a lot of work on like the political implications of the free speech thing, both First Amendment from the government and then kind of the culture of free speech or cancel culture kind of. But it's interesting how it's having these cognitive effects because in some ways when you restrict people's free speech, you're forcing them to not acknowledge certain realities and pretend certain other things that are not real actually are real. You're kind of forcing people to live in a fantasy land. Like if I'm supposed to look at this man in a dress and say that is a beautiful goddess, I'm forcing myself to live in pretend land, and everybody else is too. Like how's that shape our thinking?
Yeah. So suppression, repression, denial. those are, phrases again that I think even just the general public knows that suppression is when we take thoughts that we're having and we stuff them down. Repression is when we do the suppression so frequently that it becomes kind of automatic. And then denial is when we're not even fully aware of those thoughts, right? Even if somebody says like, "Hey, are you mad?" And I'm like, "No, no, I'm not mad," even though like I'm obviously deep inside furious. If I've been in denial about something for so long, I might even, it might take someone to help me to really unpack that and connect the dots to even acknowledge like what I'm really mad about or whatever. So to your point, cognitively, when we start making certain speech or words or ideas taboo to even talk about, they don't go away, but they do go out of our awareness. And then we are less able to, rationally act upon and evaluate those ideas. So, again, it's so interesting, but like, if you wanted to say reduce racism, if you wanted people to think truly productively and openly about, say, again, the black crime rate, because that's something that's in the news a lot right now, and frankly, the black community suffers from it the most
Mhm.
because they're the number one targets and recipients of black crime. But if we can't talk about that openly and talk about why it's happening, then we have to be in suppression and repression and denial about it. And then we're less able to actually think about potential interventions or solutions. And then when we have to pretend that we don't see it or don't, recognize any statistical association between this group and violent crime, if we can't confront that consciously, then we're more prone to say acting it out, right? So to just say, well, I don't know why. I just don't happen to have any, friends in that community. It's just, nothing personal, just never happened. And we don't realize that maybe even unconsciously we're walking away from or putting distance between ourselves and that group because we're aware of this crime issue, but yet we can't talk about it directly. Also, many studies have shown that our problem-solving skills are facilitated through dialogue. It helps us to develop good ideas and to discard bad ideas. Also, through heart-to-hearts, our cortisol levels drop and we have deeper social bonds. And we all know that social support is critical to mental health. So, I mean, you asked specifically about the cognitive side, and I'm meandering a bit into the emotional and the social support side. But just even on the cognitive side, when we talk about our ideas and we say them aloud, it allows us to evaluate them objectively and to have a healthy separation between ourselves and our thoughts. So if I can talk about my thoughts, we've all had the experience even of saying something aloud, and as we say it, saying, you know what, as I say it aloud, it doesn't make any sense, right? As I hear myself say it. And it's through putting, again, that interior amorphous life into language, it gives us a sense of control and ability to evaluate it. And when we interrupt that process by making certain things unsayable and we prevent people from, using language fully, I think we actually even interrupt their cognitive process. Ironically, again, to step away from ideas like racism or sexism. I'm sorry, I know I'm going on and on. I'll just say one more thing about this, which is just that as well in the book, I explore people who have walked away from the KKK, people who have walked away from jihadi mentality, jihadi recruiters. They all say that the way that this occurred for them was by dialogue, was by somebody sitting, not by somebody saying, you're not allowed to say that. And then they said, well, okay, then I guess I won't think it anymore. They got away from those bad ideas by somebody actually drawing them out and having deep conversations and coming to realize that their ideas didn't make sense. That's how they changed.
Wow, that's so powerful. I What's coming up for me is that there's a certain type of person, and this person's generally a younger man who just enjoys being rebellious. I enjoy saying things that society doesn't like because I like to upset people because I get some kind of a thrill out of being like a bad boy or whatever. when I was growing up, like high school, early college, for instance, this person, if they wanted to take shots at somebody, it was usually conservative Christians. Conservative Christians had a lot of power back then, and they were generally the most easily offended. And I think if you were that young man today, like, it would make sense to want to say something racist or say something sexist. Like, that's the group that has the power, the people who are easily offended by identity issues, and it's easy to offend them. Like, that's just kind of low hanging fruit for that type of guy. Like, it seems like we're making it easy to take the wrong path for that type of person.
Totally. So I share this in the book too. It's very interesting to your point about this, that it's called the forbidden fruit phenomena. Like whatever is, you're not allowed to say, it kind of ironically becomes that much more interesting or kind of glamorous or edgy. And historians, when they look back on the Weimar period of Germany, which was, directly before Hitler ascended to power, you were not allowed to say bad things about Jewish people at that time. They had all the speech codes in the world. And yet, Hitler still was able to do what he did. And historians look back, and to your exact point, they say that he might have been kind of a glamorous figure to, disaffected young men because he was, quote, underground. Like he
Mm.
couldn't do what he did out in the open. There was an underground appeal. And furthermore, because he could not go and have a public debate about his ridiculous beliefs and have somebody just openly debunk him, there was actually less ability for sunlight to be the incredible disinfectant that it is. So there's another chapter in the book called, it's called Common Objections to Free Speech, and one of them is called, well, what about misinformation? And it goes into like, okay, well, we used to also believe like Galileo was jailed for saying that the earth orbits the sun. And during COVID, the whole lab leak theory was you couldn't say that at all.
Mm.
We had physicians testifying to Congress that cigarettes are, perfectly healthy, right? And so basically when we start shutting down speech is when we, I think, get a lot more vulnerable to some very twisted misinformation. And like you said, disaffected young people can get really attached to that and go down these, radicalization rabbit holes when we don't allow the speech to just be said and let people talk it out.
Mm. Another thing that's coming up is kind of a distrust of institutions and distrust of like mainstream media, like academia, mainstream narratives. And I'm thinking there's a lot of people, it's kind of like, well, they lied to us, so we can't trust anything they said. Well, they lied to us about gender differences. So maybe women, as public intellectuals, should not be authors. Like you see that kind of line of thought, or they lied to us about black crime. So, these people over here in the alt-right are talking about that. I can trust them, but I can't trust. So there's kind of this perverse, I'm actually less trusting of these mainstream institutions and more trusting of these alternative, type of media figures.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think trust in the media is like at an all-time low. Um, and another one of those interesting features of groupthink is what's called self-appointed mind guards, right? So like this, expert class, the super academics or, the heads of global HR. Shout out to my HR friends. I have friends in HR, and like we can joke about this stuff, but whether it be like, super high ranking bureaucrats or whatever, that there's these mind guards, or frankly, even mainstream news anchors, right? Like it used to be like, well, hey, I saw it on the 6 o'clock news on CNN. It must be true. And I think Don Lemon still likes to think that he can just say something and that people will just believe it, but I think you're right that there is, as people just realize that they're in groupthink and they want to break out of it, they absolutely do start questioning everything. And they say, I'm not going to be beholden to these, self-appointed mind guards anymore. And it is too bad, because I think there is a lot of really good, credible research, obviously, like coming out of academia. I'm not saying like the whole thing is crap. But yeah, I think politicians and the media and journalists, they've done a lot to discredit themselves as well as academics too.
Mm, that's interesting. Um, yeah. You know, Something that's coming up for me is the general understanding of this is what we're doing is we're trying to protect disempowered people by these kind of speech codes, either formal or informal, just cultural speech codes. We're trying to protect the disempowered. But the reality, it seems, is speech codes are put in place by those who have power, right? Like I'm thinking of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Wrote from a Birmingham jail. He was in jail because he violated speech codes. Like the people who need free speech protections the most are the least powerful.
Yeah, that's interesting. The people who need speech protections the most are the least powerful. And that is why I think we have to adhere so closely to the First Amendment, because otherwise, you're absolutely right. We just essentially have like a mob rule, right? And politicians can, even just pander to either whatever the most politically numerous or even just simply the most politically active group, and then start making, laws that favor, their particular speech or viewpoint. The whole point of the First Amendment really is to protect the minority, is to protect, people that don't have a lot of power. But Ryan, I'm curious about this from your perspective. And I apologize. I know a little bit about you, but I don't feel like I know enough. And so your audience probably obviously knows all about you, but just in case, um, are you actually still a student yourself?
I am. I'm a grad student in clinical mental health counseling, and I graduate in December.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm super curious what that's like for you, because when you talk about people without a lot of power, that is students, right? Like, I remember being a student and like knowing if I didn't sing their freaking song, I would never get my PhD. Like talk about a lack of power. Like, you put all this time and money and everything into the school. And then at the very end, if you have to say what they want, or else you don't get that piece of paper, right? So how's that all going for you?
It's been quite frustrating. That's what I mean. Going to school is what inspired me to write a book and start a podcast and everything. Because I was like, what am I seeing here? What is going on? It turns out a lot of other people are seeing something similar. But I had somebody ask me, I forget what the question was, but basically like, why wouldn't you say XYZ in class? And I was like, no, the boundary is drawn like a mile over here. You know what I mean? The things that I've gotten a lot of pushback in class from, one of them was, I said, it was an emergent family therapy class. I said, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes objective reality can be useful in therapy. And you would act like I just kicked a puppy or something. I mean, it's like the type of things that just offend them, or like their thinking is so rigid and so narrow. Like I try to push back a little each class, but I do stuff really mild like that. And it's just, I mean, there was one, I was complaining because in my marriage and family therapy class, 3 out of our 4 books that we use had 0 citations. And I'm like, this is grad school. Like what? And one of them was The Ethical Slut that we were reading at the time about polyamory. And I was like, why is this grad school? And like, none of these books have any citations. And this guy looked at me like I was an idiot. He goes, well, it's their lived experience, as though that's better than citations, So just everything in grad school, it's one of the least intellectual environments I've ever been in.
Yeah, I believe it. Now, I mean, do they know about your book and your podcast? I'm surprised they haven't kicked you out.
Well, I expected to get kicked out. Actually, I got reported to the dean, and then the director of my program called me in, basically scolded me. I think another student had reported me, so they know about it, but apparently they're not going to kick me out. So I've got about 5 more weeks to hold on before graduation.
Wow. I wonder if they're just not kicking you out because they're afraid of a lawsuit. Because, like, I mean, you're obviously really challenging some of their stuff, and I understand that they have not been hospitable to it, but the fact that they have tolerated it, I actually think is quite amazing.
Yeah, because I've known a number of people who've gotten kicked out of programs for saying very similar stuff to what I'm
Yeah.
saying. Like they kicked them out. So I'm happy that I haven't been kicked out yet. But I'm not going
Yeah.
to stop speaking either.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but like, do you mind sharing what city and state you're going to school or anything?
I'm in Austin, Texas. I'm not going to say the name of the
Yeah.
institution until I get that
Yeah.
diploma in my hand, but I'm in Austin, Texas. I'm doing my internship at addiction rehab. And the amazing thing is the addiction world, the treatment center world is completely different from the rest of the therapy world. You're looking at a client who may have just come off of an overdose or a suicide attempt or something like that. It's a very visceral, like life and death issue right in front of you. You can't like play around with intersectionality. Like you have to actually help this person, you know? And everybody in the treatment world knows that. So we tend to take our jobs very seriously and don't bring a lot of politics into it.
So that's interesting. And I think you should feel fortunate for that because I've talked to many people, mental health in the addiction world, and they say that they're not having that experience. So, for
Really?
example, yeah, like the whole harm reduction model, right?
Yeah.
Like where they're like, oh, well, we'll just give this person a safe injection site. And, this is the healthiest thing we can do. Or I talked to a therapist. I was at a Turning Point USA event actually over the summer. And I talked to a therapist in the Portland area, and
Mm,
she said it is commonplace for the social workers of which she is
mm.
to they're with these addicts, they get their Narcan, and then they like or we did their whatever, I can't even remember, but she said that it's regular for the therapist to get punched out. She said that these people, they do their safe injections, they pass out, and then they wake up violent, and that if the therapists want to say like, hey, like, is this really helping anybody here, again, that they get the whole, you're a bigot cold shoulder routine. So it's awesome that you're actually having a sane experience where you're doing that work.
But, I think one thing that makes a big difference, there's like kind of these social workers that like view drug addicts as like these beings from a foreign world kind of thing. Everybody that I work with I'm in recovery myself. Everybody I work with is in recovery. So we kind of view the harm reduction thing as a joke, like
Uh-huh.
a cruel joke kind of thing. Like
Uh-huh.
we would not view a safe injection site as a compassionate act. Like
Uh-huh.
that's not how like we look at things, because we've gone through that process ourselves and realize, I mean, I don't want to say tough love, but some degree of challenging the client is a very compassionate act. Affirming the client is not compassionate if they believe that heroin is nutritious.
No, I totally believe that. I mean, yeah, healthy boundaries. I do think tough love is better than enabling. I think that's what a lot of the, drug harm reduction type stuff does is enable. And, it's really infantilizing. And it kind of connects to this other conversation that is being had right now about, should we bring back asylums and things? And, I remember as well, being with people. I did some of my training at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, which is a very, very tough public hospital. We would sometimes have to have police escorts to take us from the subway, to the hospital. And I just remember a lot of times, people would be in there having been very violent with themselves or others. And then after like a day or two of being stabilized, if they would say the magic words, I've learned some skills and I'm not going to do that anymore, we pretty much had to release them. Like we weren't even legally allowed to insist that they stay because that would be, quote, violating their rights. And there's no linkage of rights and responsibilities then, right? Of saying, okay, well, fine, then, you have the right to leave, but you must, be on this medication or, whatever. It was just like, well, that's up to them if they want to do that or not. And I was like, okay, well, then how is it that they can get arrested for violent behavior, but get light treatment on a mental health defense, but then not have to, receive mental health care because they have the right to not have to do that? It just, as you said, it doesn't feel compassionate to that person. It feels enabling. And it doesn't feel fair to society either.
Yeah, I mean, my sister works in downtown Austin, and she'll text me, saw a homeless woman pooping outside my office today. Just, and you like San Francisco, you see people shooting up until their limbs rot off, like people just living in filth. It's
Uh,
not safe.
uh-huh.
There's just crime all over the place. Like that just does not seem like, I get where the initial thought might sound compassionate to you, but that does not look compassionate to me.
Yeah, yeah, they always have a way of making it sound compassionate, right? Like harm reduction, right? Or whatever. I mean, you shied away from the term tough love, but I actually love that term. I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think sometimes setting boundaries is the most loving thing, and just telling someone the truth is the kindest thing that you can do. So, I mean, but I'm curious for you. How did you go through all of this training and keep your head on straight?
So I think, like you, I had gone back to school a little bit later. I'm trying to remember. I think it was like 33 years old that I went back to school. I graduated at 35. I had a couple years under my belt before I dropped out because of an alcohol and drug problem. So I'd gone through the addiction, got sober. I had a lot of years working at various different jobs. I worked in the restaurant industry a lot,
Right.
construction, landscaping, a bunch of different jobs. Then I started working in treatment, and you start seeing, it was not a direct clinical role, but I saw this population a lot, saw what works, what doesn't. And one of the things I saw is I saw people who, like, if, you want to use the word tough love, phrase tough love, people who got that tough love treatment afterwards, when they got sober and they're starting to do well in life, they're extremely grateful for those people who gave them that. If you just kind of let them do whatever they want, they're going to go out and relapse. They're not going to remember you. Their life's going to fall apart. But you actually hold them accountable and be firm and confronting bad behavior and bad thought processes, and their life actually turns around. They're extremely grateful for what you gave them and the tools that you gave them. And I started to observe that. And then I got to grad school, and it was a completely different, what do you call it, the affirmation model or validation only, whatever. Um, I'm thinking, I asked a number of professors this. There's one like really just stuck in my mind. I asked a professor, talking about your only role is to validate everything the client says. You're basically like their paid friend, essentially. It's kind of like I call it the customer's always right model.
Almost like a hooker, right? Like, oh, wow,
Yes,
you're so
yes.
great. I love it. Like
Yeah,
just
that's
whatever you say is
Yeah,
woo.
it's like an emotional hooker. You're right.
Yeah.
And I asked the professor, I said, okay, what if I have a client who says, my truth is that heroin is good for me? And he looked at me and he thought for a second and he goes, if your client is a heterosexual white male, you might be able to confront them because that might not be true for them. But if they're any kind of marginalized population, you have to respect their truth. And I'm like, so if I have like a gay black client, I'm just supposed to let him go die of an overdose? Like, that sounds so sadistic. It made me so mad.
It is so ridiculous too, because what he's suggesting there is that based on skin color or, sex, we have different intellectual and emotional capacities, right? It's just, it's such racism. I mean, it's ironic to me how these people, and again, I come at this truly from like, I try to have the most compassionate, approach, like in my book. I I say, and I know that this isn't always true. I'm sure that there are people that are manipulating speech codes for truly nefarious purposes. But I say, look, I believe that most of these people are genuinely coming from a good place. They want to reduce racism. They want to reduce hatefulness. They want to reduce bullying. They want, better quality of information out there. They're just really misguided in thinking that the way to do that is by limiting speech. And so I want to share with them, some statistics and some research. It's interesting when we learn that the people that are most likely to stifle speech or end conversations over political differences are also statistically the most likely to literally commit actual political violence or to endorse political violence.
Wow.
And that's because, as anybody knows, if we're working with violent offenders, the first thing we want to do is boost their emotional vocabulary, get them to learn how to sort out problems with dialogue. We don't want to shut down dialogue, even
No.
though, like you said, it can sound nice. Like, oh, I'm going no contact because of so and so voted for so and so. And, but anyway, yeah, it's wild the things that we hear, like you just gave examples of in your program and some other examples that I unpack in the book of people that are, I believe they are well intentioned, but if you just look at what they're actually saying, it's ironically the most hateful, racist, bigoted stuff. There's somebody else, I learned a new phrase. I wish I could remember who said it so I could give him credit, but it's called the celebration paradox. And the idea there is that you're only allowed to notice and discuss group differences if you're saying something positive about the minority, right? So like you could say about a certain cultural group, well, they tend to really value family ties, and they have a high relational closeness. But if you say, well, they tend to have a lot of intermarriage amongst, first and second degree relatives, well, then you can't say that because that's, racist or biased. But if you just say the positive part, and it happens with women too. Like you can say, oh, well, these days, the field of law is, I don't know, say 60% women. I don't know. And that's a great thing because it shows that women have made these big gains. But if you say, well, a lot of the, feminine traits of agreeableness taking over in the law as women are more prevalent in the law, that might be having some difficult effects upon the justice system. Well, you can't
Mm,
say that because that's sexist, right? So
mm.
it's called the celebration paradox. I wish I could remember who said it.
Yeah, it's like you can say things universally about people, but if you say things about men specifically, they can either be neutral or negative, and about women, it can be either be neutral or positive. And similar, like with race or sexual orientation, like that's how you have to apply things. It's like it just gets bizarre. One thing that I wanted to bring up and get your opinion on is cognitive behavioral therapy, because that's
Sure.
a very controversial one. I feel like in our field. And I know that there's, some legitimate critiques of, is it shallow? Is it really as evidence-based as they say? There's some legitimate critiques, but a lot of people speak very highly of CBT in our field. In my program, it's considered an appropriate treatment if you're a heterosexual white male. And if you're any kind of marginalized identity, CBT is not appropriate because, and I quote, rationality is racist and anti-black. So
Which is
what's
the
your take
most
on it?
insulting thing in the world you could say to Black people, right? I mean, to suggest that that the Black community would not be amenable to a rationality based, I mean, like I would find that so insulting. But just to stick with your question about, what are my thoughts about CBT, and I'll just say whatever thoughts I have about it apply to people regardless of their race or gender, Um, I think CBT is great in certain situations, and I think psychodynamic therapy is great in certain situations. So I personally, as I mentioned, I was an emancipated minor, and so I had a lot of psychodynamic therapy starting when I was about 17 until I was about 23. And it was super helpful. I needed to just kind of in an open-ended way talk my way through things, discover feelings that maybe I was sort of hiding from myself, or have a lot of, kind of even just having a caring, concerned adult of the therapist, taking an interest in me and asking me questions to stimulate some insight and some maturity, I think was super helpful. But then when I was like 22 or maybe 23, I came upon a CBT therapist. And it wasn't even like I said, oh, I need a CBT therapist. It was just by a stroke of luck. I had moved and I needed a new therapist. And she took a very CBT approach. And there were certain problems that I had been kind of hemming and hawing about for years. And I think without knowing it, I had reached the point where just reflecting and talking about it was becoming counterproductive, or at least stagnating. I wasn't doing anything anymore. And having someone just say, like, well, here, how about this? What would make sense to do about that problem? Can you do that by next week? Um, that was super helpful. But I think if somebody had just jumped in with that right from the start, that might not have been so helpful. So
Mm,
I think sometimes it's really good to have a foundation of psychodynamic approaches to make sure we really
mm,
fully understand, why are you smoking cigarettes? What does it mean to
mm.
you? Or, whatever. But then at a certain point, it's just time to stop smoking, right? So I think there's a time and a place for everything.
That's interesting how you wove both of those together. I work exclusively with men, and I feel like a lot of them are very grateful to have like a tangible toolkit to hold on to. I think that works well a lot of times for men. They seem to be grateful for it. And I'll say men of all different races and straight and gay. You know, um, I wonder if you could comment on what you're seeing in the therapy profession in terms of political bias and free speech issues.
Yes, political bias and free speech issues. I want to answer that question, but I just had another thought I wanted to
Yeah.
tell you. Since you said you only have 5 weeks left in your program, and you've told me these amazing things that have been said to you, like some of this stuff is just shocking. I really think if it's not illegal, you should check your local laws and all that kind of stuff. I think that you should consider getting like a Project Veritas type camera and just see how much of these professors saying this stuff to you, like, oh, well, if it's a such and such, if it's a black client, then you should do this therapy. But if it's a white client, you should do that therapy or whatever. I think that could be like a gold mine of for a variety of different reasons if it's legal for you to obtain.
I wish I had done that earlier in my like actual like theory classes. I'm just in my internship class right now, so it's just my classmates talking about their current clients. So I don't there's not much controversy anymore.
I
But the
bet you'll have
first
some interesting exit conversations. I think
yeah,
you should try it
that's an interesting
if it's
thought.
legal. But
Yeah, that's an
yeah.
interesting thought. Thank you.
Yeah. So but yeah, about you said what was your question again? I'm sorry. About
So looking at the therapy profession, what are you seeing in terms of political bias and like free speech issues?
yeah, oh my goodness, it's awful. So the our profession, the mental health field in general, the faculty is like literally 90% plus liberal identifying. And so then they're only admitting students that, espouse their social justice narrative. They're only hiring faculty that are, along those lines. And the trend has gotten worse. Like naturally, it becomes like a self-reinforcing bias. So I think like in the early 2000s, maybe the field, just rough numbers, was like say 70%. But then it reached this tipping point where like the whole faculty is in a certain mindset and just won't admit people to the faculty or as students, that have different perspectives. And so I do think that there's this huge groupthink. And so then there's this incredible emphasis on, say, getting rid of hate speech, getting rid of bullying, protecting trans, identities and all this stuff. And then anybody that's asking any questions or raising any points outside of that orthodoxy is ostracized. And I could tell you stories. I know we're out of time. I won't be able to tell you now, but I can tell you all kinds of stories about stuff that happened to me in my professional life, from my own colleagues, like even because during Me Too, was supporting an organization that was trying to assist men that were falsely accused of sexual misconduct. And, the treatment I got, from people within my own profession, it's been incredible. So, yeah, I mean, people say like, well, why would politics matter? But politics, if you take it back to its etymology, it's just a word for our public life and our shared public spaces. And so when you think about like the political identification of people, if you have a very narrow viewpoint about that, and then that becomes the same people with that very narrow homogenous viewpoint that are telling everybody what's healthy, what's sane, and sane, meaning like able to be accepted. It feels ironically fascistic and totalitarian, like which is exactly what they say that they're against, right? So I'm afraid it's not a pretty picture, but the good news is I do think with thanks to shows like yours and books like mine, I do think that the public is starting to wake up. I think that's why there's a huge distrust of the mental health field right now, and I actually think that's very healthy that people are starting to maybe say like, well, gee, maybe I should go to church, or maybe I should just talk to some friends and family and neighbors, and maybe I should focus on my physical health, right? Like maybe my stress levels and my depression and everything else would get a little better if I went to the gym, instead of some therapist that just validates everything I say and encourages me to drop contact with my parents. Like all the things that like we've heard of therapists doing these days, it feels so unhealthy.
Mm. You talked about the lack of trust in our field. I want to touch on that for a second because I was talking to Wilfred Riley. I don't know if you know the social scientist Wilfred Riley, but I was talking to him and we are talking about how amongst like a certain type of like progressive upper middle class woman, having a therapist is like a necessary form of social capital, right? There's like this left leaning idea that everybody needs to go to therapy, everybody benefits from therapy, all this stuff. And there's like a right leaning idea. I'm thinking you got Abigail Schreier's Bad Therapy, you've got Matt Walsh kind of on a tirade about how all therapy is either useless or harmful. So you've got progressives saying therapy is always good, always useful, and conservatives saying therapy is bad. But Republicans, Democrats, and Independents all have mental health needs. Like, how can you? What do you say about that tension there?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Well, we talked about how therapists in some levels can be like an emotional hooker, right? They can also be like an emotional lawyer, right? Like, so I've heard people kind of use their therapist as cover. Like, well, my therapist says that you're being narcissistic, and that, like as if like, well, because I got my therapist to say it, that everybody else has to, accommodate me, right? But yeah, I think everybody does have mental health needs. However, even by self-report, people who are liberal are much more likely to, self-report as having a mental health diagnosis. Now, what I think liberal people would say to that is, they're just, they've taken away the stigma and they're just more willing to say so. However, I'm not entirely sure that I would agree with that. Because again, I think that this squelching of free speech is not good for people's mental health. I think it cuts down on their self-efficacy and puts them into a lot of repression and denial. And I don't think that is good for their mental health. And again, it also leads to violent acting out when people can't use their words. So I have something in the book I call the 5 Ds, which is defriending, disinviting a speaker, dropping contact in real life, distancing in real life, or declining to date across the aisle, the 5 Ds. And liberals are statistically more likely to do all of those things over political differences. And again, they would say, hey, that's because we're virtuous. We won't be friends with Nazis, right? And then they're also statistically much more likely, according to recent U.gov polls, for example, and other polls, to endorse political violence. So I do think that there is an issue of mental health on the left. But on the other hand, as you said, of course, conservatives need mental health care as well. And I don't blame conservatives for being very, very wary of being pathologized when they do go potentially, for mental health care. Because like I said, I talk to many young men through an organization called FACE, Families Advocating for Campus Equality, about young men falsely accused of sexual misconduct. And they all said that when they tried to go to a therapist to talk about the trauma of having been falsely accused, the therapist every single time tried to tell them that maybe they actually did it and that they just didn't know, what sexual abuse was. And, can you imagine like a woman going to a therapist and saying I was sexually abused, and the therapist saying like, well, maybe you asked for it, right? And this is like, it's, so I do think that Republicans or conservatives have a very legitimate concern of being pathologized. I mean, I think Pamela Greenbaum, or whatever her name is, I think she's the truthful therapist or something.
Pamela Garfield Yeager.
Yeah, she, I believe, published a video of like a CEU continuing education training where they were like talking about, deprogramming people who voted for Trump, right? And that's like literally half the country. So I do think that conservatives have a legitimate concern about if mental health is like really going to be open to them. And overall, when we're talking about a group of people, mental health fields that are telling us that men can become women and whatnot, I'm not sure I want to take mental health guidance from that particular group of people, right? So I don't know.
I'm going to make a statement. I want to tell you, I want you to tell me how accurate you think it is. I think liberals or progressives go to too much therapy. I think there's this tendency to ruminate about my mental health, my feelings, how am I feeling, what's going on? Do I have multiple personalities? Let me watch 50 TikTok videos by mental health influencers and, am I borderline? Start to just ruminate and just obsess and focus on it. Whereas conservatives are more likely to, somewhat rightfully understand that there's a huge bias in their profession. They might not be treated fairly. but also more likely to kind of push down some of those things when it's like maybe you should go see someone about that childhood trauma. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, if you told me there's two people, one of them really needs therapy but isn't going, one of them doesn't need therapy but is going compulsively, which one is liberal and which one is conservative? Like, I think we can all guess like how we would, apply that, right? But I do think that conservatives, for example, who tend to be higher on religiosity, and I think somebody also said now it's like it's conservative to go to the gym or something like that, right? And all of these things, religiosity, going to the gym, also say like, being married and having kids, all of these things that we know actually are good for mental health, but sometimes also get coded as, being on the right. I just think that there's more than one way, to achieve mental health. But you might be right that maybe there's a stigma about mental health within the right. But to be honest, I haven't seen it. Maybe it's just because I'm a psychologist and I lived in New York for 20 years.
Mm.
I only just recently moved to Florida. But I've never encountered anyone that's like had like a serious stigma about people
Mm.
going in for mental health care. I just haven't actually really seen that much.
Mm. That's good. That is encouraging. So I've got two questions left for you, and the first one should be a softball for you. How do we fix the therapy profession?
Gosh, that's not a softball at all, Ryan. How do we fix the therapy profession? Well, I think that there's actually been, I've seen some interesting proposals about ideas that say schools that take federal funding should have intellectual diversity. So, for example, if there were, say, quotas that psychology departments had to have at least 30%, politically conservative or independent faculty, like that in itself could probably do a lot right there. But to be honest, I don't know how to fix a profession that goes around, saying that men can become women or that, if somebody is white and hetero, then you offer them this type of therapy, but not if they're black, because as you said, you were told that group doesn't relate well to rationality. I'm sorry, Ryan, but I don't know that one. That's not an easy question.
Okay, I mean that's fair. This is a tough one. I think we're in a hole as a profession.
You tell me. You said it's easy. How do we do it?
Um, I mean, I think one of the big debates that I see, because I've probably asked over 100 people this question last year, and one of the big debates is it more about reforming our current institutions or creating parallel institutions?
Hmm.
And so I see like the major players, first of all, basically all of academia, plus the American Counseling Association, American Psychological Association, National Association of Social Work. Those are your behemoths in the field, and they're all completely controlled by progressive ideology. And then you've got these tiny organizations, Open Therapy Institute, Critical Therapy Antidote, that I think are doing really good work, but it's just such a David and Goliath battle. So is it more about we're going to reform the APA, or we're going to focus on these kind of smaller organizations to try to get them up to a competitive level? And I don't really know the answer to that. I'm pretty involved with CTA, but I really don't. I mean, it really does feel like a David versus Goliath battle right now.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm glad that maybe you agree that actually the question wasn't so easy after all,
Yeah.
because I don't know. That's a hard one.
So my final question for you is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not dealing with enough that we should talk about more?
The mental health benefits of free speech. Yeah, that's part of the reason I wrote the book, because I think that people have it in their minds like, okay, so say you're at like a soccer moms, meeting or a school board meeting or an HR meeting or whatever. I think people have this idea in their minds that, well, to just err on the side of safety, to make sure that, we really create the best space for everyone. We'll just say like in the name of our anti-bullying campaign, you can't say this, or we're not going to discuss ideas like that or whatever. And I want to give the public a way to answer back and to say, hey, wait a minute, if we're actually concerned about mental health here, if we're actually concerned about kindness, then we should actually make sure that people can handle debate. We can make sure that people can handle, disagreement. I think it's making people really fragile and neurotic, to have this idea that they can't have their ideas challenged, or that people who have different ideas about marriage or race or sexuality or crime or immigration or abortion, that those types of ideas can't be expressed. I mean, even just seeing the reaction to people trying to start Turning Point USA chapters in their high school, right? And it leads to this incredible misunderstanding of people. Like they really believe that people on the right are Nazis, are fascists, are racist, are all these things. So I think what we're not talking about enough, that we should, is the mental health benefits of free speech, and flipping that conversation about hate speech and bullying around and saying, well, instead of putting out a bunch of politically correct speech codes and whatnot because we're so concerned about hate speech and bullying, we should realize that what's actually hateful and what's actually bullying is to essentially cut out people's tongues. Like that's what we really shouldn't be doing. And people will sort out their differences and figure things out and problem solve and learn how to coexist, really more through learning how to have open dialogue, even if there is disagreement, than this ridiculous stifling of people.
I love that answer. Dr. Chloe Carmichael, thank you so much for joining me today. I love this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, and people can go to freespeechtoday.com if they want to get the book, which I'd really appreciate. And if they do, and they send me a screenshot or let me know that they got the book, I'll invite you to, I'd like to have a reading club or something where we can all talk about what's in the book.
Very cool. Very cool.